Well, hello and welcome everybody to another of our Roads events, trying to pack in as many as possible before they dismantle this building and shove it across the road into new digs. And when you're putting together a list at short notice, because I was only appointed in July, you have to say, okay, how do you have some impact events that people might actually want to? You're trying to signal to the community, not just the usual suspects, etc. And this was one of the people who immediately sprung to mind. Rick Perlstein's possibly my favourite historian, I have to say that. And one book in particular, which is called The Invisible Bridge, which is this amazing, incredible book which takes Reagan as this figure who was incredible, as I say, long and wrong for his time in the 60s. And then he walks you through the 1970s and the politics and turmoil of that decade. And then every now and again you go back to Reagan as a kind of figure, and then he's slightly less out of time. And then by the time you get to the end of the decade, it's almost as if the whole world has swung to him. He hasn't changed at all, thus the invisible bridge. So I wanted to know what happened next, so I wrote to Reagan and said, you want to come up and give a talk? And he said, yeah, because I'm actually working on the kind of prequel and then what happens afterwards. Because at the same time that Reagan was ascendant, there was this guy, Jimmy Carter, and what we forget at the time was that Carter was fantastically popular, united the Democratic Party, wasn't tainted by Watergate. There was a whole politics there for Democratic Party to really be reborn and become powerful, and they completely blew it. So, and you know, anybody who's spent time, I've been in this country nearly 30 years. I mean, the refrain is, you know, the Democrats never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So I'm interested in the original story as to how they missed an opportunity, and I think that's what we're going to get some of now. As is normal, what we'll do is Rick will talk for a while, then we will chat for a while, and then we'll bring everybody else in, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Well, Mark, maybe we'll discover that what your noble countryman Winston Churchill said about the United States will be true about the Democratic Party, which is that they always do the right thing once they exhaust every other opportunity.
Once every single other opportunity has been exhausted,
yes,
they will do the right thing.
Yes, we'll see.
After you.
So I'm going to give a presentation I'm going to read, and a lot of this is based on, yes, the book I'm working on now, which is going to cover the years from 1976 to 1980, and it's going to be called Reaganland. And, of course, it ends with Ronald Reagan being elected president. And, not incidentally, Jimmy Carter being unelected president. So in May of 1979, the chairman of Jimmy Carter's brand new presidential re-election committee gave a speech in which he said, "We haven't done one thing in this administration that has gotten us votes." He was bragging. From the beginning, Jimmy Carter's political calling card had always been his promise, as he put it in a famous speech he would deliver 6 weeks later on what he called the American people's crisis of confidence, that he would deliver honest answers, not easy answers. The soul of Carter's dour truth-telling was that after decades of American abundance, the American people now had to make do with less from their government. He was hardly the first Democrat to say so. There was Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin, chairman of the Congressional Joint Economic Committee and a former investment banker, who, a 1972 New Republic profile marveled, seemed to invite a taxpayer revolt against government itself. There were the Watergate babies swept into office in 1974, many of them representing traditionally Republican suburbs, whose leader, Gary Hart, flayed, quote, Eleanor Roosevelt Democrats who cling to the Roosevelt model long after it had ceased to relate to reality. There was Michael Dukakis, who was elevated to the Massachusetts State House in 1979. The UPI analyzed his successful campaign. The Democrats were the conservatives. Michael S. Dukakis of the New Deal and Great Society Party said he was going to run the state like a bank. There was Governor Jerry Brown of California, the only candidate to beat Jimmy Carter in a Democratic primary in 1976. In December, CBS News ran an expose on a series of accidental deaths in California's decrepit mental hospitals. Doctors blamed not just Ronald Reagan's budget cuts, he'd been the previous governor, but Jerry Brown's. Here was how Brown answered his critics. And I queued up a little video that I took at the Vanderbilt News Archive. So, Luke, you can run that first video. No, not that one. The one where that's from my Google.
Can you put the volume up?
Invest massive sums of money in order
Okay, go back to the start and hit the volume. That's great. Pull it back.
It's my job to try to make those hard choices. And I try to be
417.
compassionate.
417.
But I also have a certain amount of common sense. And every group wants a little more. And it's my
No,
job.
That's it. That's fine.
Yeah.
Society does have limits.
So remember, people are dying in mental hospitals.
Highways and mental hospitals, there is a limit. And I'm reluctant to invest massive sums of money when ordinary citizens are finding it very hard to meet their own bills. And it's my job to try to make those hard choices. And I try to be compassionate, but I also have a certain amount of common sense. And every group wants a little more. And it's my job to give them a little less.
Thanks.
For years, critics of mental
When Bill Clinton declared in his 1996 State of the Union address that the era of big government is over, it was treated as some fresh new thing. It was actually a stale old thing. People had forgotten the presidency of Jimmy Carter, for instance, who had declared in his 1978 State of the Union, government cannot solve our problems, it can't set our goals, it cannot define our vision, government cannot eliminate poverty or provide a bountiful economy or reduce inflation or save our cities or cure illiteracy or provide energy. In 1976, he had campaigned on turning welfare into workfare, slashing government bureaucracy, and almost obsessively on balancing the budget. He said to a historian, "I wish you could have seen the stricken expressions on the faces of those Democratic leaders when I talked about balancing the budget. That wasn't the kind of thing a Democratic president was supposed to do. When it came to economics," he said, "all they knew about was stimulus and Great Society programs." His first announced appointment was a conservative Georgia banker as director of Office of Management and Budget. Because he inherited a slowing GDP growth and a 7.8% unemployment rate, his economists begged him to propose a stimulus package. Reluctantly, he put forward one worth $31.2 billion, anchored by a $50 one-time rebate for all taxpayers. By comparison, in inflation-adjusted dollars, Barack Obama's 2009 stimulus was about 10 times that. Then, at the slightest sign of an economic uptick, Carter withdrew the plan. His next fiscal move was announcing a hit list of 80 public works projects he wished to see canceled. One of them was the massive Central Arizona project. Congressman Morris Udall of Arizona said that without it, Tucson and Phoenix are going to dry up and blow away. In between, Carter delivered his first famous fireside chat, in which he donned a mustard-colored cardigan sweater, preempted Charlie's Angels, and addressed a problem that the American people did not even know was a problem. He began by observing that a home heating oil shortage in the Northeast during a record cold winter wasn't an anomaly, but a symptom of a dangerous new structural problem. Then he said, and if you could show the Jimmy Carter video at 4:14.
We must face the fact that the energy shortage is
Volume
permanent.
again.
There is no way we can solve it quickly. But if we all cooperate and make modest sacrifices, if we learn to live thriftily and remember the importance of helping our neighbors, then we can find ways to adjust and to make our society more efficient and our own lives more enjoyable and productive. Utility companies must promote conservation and not consumption. Oil and natural gas companies must be honest with all of us about their reserves and profits. We will find out the difference between real shortages and artificial ones. We'll ask private companies to sacrifice, just as private citizens must do. All of us must learn.
Oops. Getting to the good part. He says, you can just stop. Let's say what he says. He says everyone has to turn their thermostats down to 65 degrees, 55 degrees at night, which he later made a federal order. So this part of Carter's austerity instincts, as we know, was prophetic. Until 1973, except during World War II, there really was no conception of energy as something susceptible to shortages. In the 1960s, government officials predicted domestic fuel reserves were, quote, adequate to satisfy expected requirements for the remainder of the century at costs near present levels. Then, of course, in the fall of 1973, when the Arab members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries began embargoing oil to the U.S. to punish America's support of Israel, for months, gas lines stretched for hours and for blocks. Then, almost before it began, the crisis was over. In fact, between then and Carter's fireside chat, the price of petroleum fell. Americans, including many senators, decided the shortage had been a temporary inconvenience staged by greedy oil companies. They had to wait until 1979 and the Iranian Revolution to learn how vulnerable America's energy supply truly was. But one thing the 1977 response that conspiracy theory attested to was the difficulty a society built upon the expectation of eternal abundance had with wrapping its mind around the concept of scarcity. It is not too much to say that Jimmy Carter considered his most important project as president to teach the American people the imperative of doing so. When it came to energy, this inclination was noble, but Carter also, with an equally urgent passion, preached governmental scarcity, and this was tragic. As this guy demonstrated in Austerity, the history of a dangerous idea, the notion that government can make nations more prosperous by spending less on public goods has never worked. And in Jimmy Carter's case, I will argue it profoundly contributed to the long-term diminishment of the political prospects of his own Democratic Party. One of the promises in the party platform Jimmy Carter ran on was the passage of the full employment bill introduced in 1974 by Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota and Representative Augustus Hawkins of South Central Los Angeles. Carter accepted this with greatest reluctance as the price he had to pay to win the loyalty of party liberals. If passed in its original form, Humphrey Hawkins would have installed a form of democratic socialism within the bosom of the American state. It would have required the Federal Reserve to use monetary policy to produce an unemployment rate of 3% or less within 18 months at prevailing wages. Should the Fed fail, the law required the federal government to directly provide citizens jobs and gave citizens the power to sue the federal government for failing to do so. Prospects for congressional passage looked good in 1975 when the unemployment rate was 9%, and the Democrats welcomed the prospect of making President Ford look like a Grinch going into an election year if he vetoed it. Then, in the spring of 1976, with unemployment steadily trending downward, what Business Week called a who's who of liberal economists weighed in to call the plan a recipe for inflation. Legislative progress stalled. The version the House reconsidered in 1978 was severely watered down. Its requirement of public jobs became a mere goal of working towards 4% unemployment, not 3%, within 5 years instead of 18 months, by relying, quote, primarily on private enterprise. Some predicted Carter might veto even that. Inflation was now the administration's obsession. By spring of 1978, it was 6.8%. It was accompanied by a stubbornly high 6.4 unemployment rate, the dreaded combination previously believed impossible among Keynesian economists known as stagflation. What had caused this? How could policymakers solve it? Even now, economists debating the question are no closer to a consensus than they were then. I'll list some explanations, saving one for later. One, most agree it had something to do with Lyndon Johnson's refusal to raise taxes to pay for the Vietnam War, while simultaneously increasing spending for his Great Society. Two, Richard Nixon played a role. In August of 1971, facing a stubborn recession and an upcoming re-election fight, he ordered a radical package of economic reforms that included a 90-day freeze on wages and prices, which he extended for 3 years. When wage and price controls finally ceased, prices gushed forth like water held back by a failed dam. OPEC was crucial. The price of a barrel of crude actually declined in real dollars between 1950 and 1973 when it was $3.60. Now it was $25.10. America's first trade imbalance since the 19th century might have contributed, but in complicated ways, not well understood. So did the increased international currency speculation that followed Nixon taking America off the gold standard. So did declining productivity, but whether this was a cause or effect of inflation was not understood and remains a mystery. The coming of age of the children of the post-war baby boom might have thrown some sort of previous equilibrium out of whack. And it also seems intuitive to me that the explosion of consumer debt contributed. Between 1944 and 1976, while the US population grew 44%, credit card debt increased 1,300%. 1 in 5 consumers never paid off their balance in full. It surely became easier for producers to raise prices when people could charge things now and not pay for them later. And finally, wages were being bid up by a tight labor market. In conclusion, the great inflation of the 1970s was bafflingly complicated. What's more, it would have defied easy policy solution, even if economists had been able to figure it out, because none of these developments were bells that could be unrung. You couldn't, unbaby boom the baby boom. There was, however, another explanation for what caused the great inflation. It was the conservative, or if you prefer, neoliberal one. When conservatives cited it, they didn't call it a contributing factor. They said it was the only cause of inflation everywhere and at all times. It was simple. Inflation was caused by governments spending too much. And this was easy to unring. Just take away government's credit card. Consider the words of the most eloquent spokesman for this theory, the former governor of California, then preparing to run for the presidency in 1980. As Ronald Reagan put it in a 1976 radio commentary praising Milton Friedman for his new Nobel Prize, inflation occurs when the growth of the nation's money supply outstrips the growth in the nation's productivity. The federal government controls the nation's money supply and is therefore the primary source of inflation. In truth, inflation is simply another tax imposed by Washington in the name of easy money. Washington taxed the citizenry with easy money in order to buy short-term votes via goodies paid for from an artificially inflated federal treasury. What Reagan called, quote, the direct responsibility of a spendthrift, Democratic-controlled Congress that has been unwilling to discipline itself to live within our means. There hasn't been a day in the last 2 decades when they couldn't have curbed the spending, ended the inflation, and in so doing, reduced unemployment if they wanted to. Now here is the important turn for our argument. Jimmy Carter agreed. Whenever he made a public statement about inflation, he attributed its causes to excessive government spending. What's more, you will search Carter's statements high and low for a reflection about the baleful long-term political consequences of this conviction. Prior to the age of stagflation, the glory of Keynesianism for the Democrats was that public spending that it called for to guard against downturns in the economic cycle had the political virtue of making the Democratic Party the bestower of gifts voted from the public purse to a grateful citizenry. Gifts like dams. As anguished conservatives complained every time they lost an election, nobody shoots Santa Claus. But Jimmy Carter relished shooting Santa Claus. And by the 1978 campaign season, as the inflation rate approached 9%, the consequences for the Democratic coalition were becoming everywhere apparent. As again and again, Carter stepped on the toes of candidates who weren't reading from the austerity script. At one stop, he campaigned for North Carolina's populist insurance commissioner, John Ingram, whom Democrats had chosen to run against Senator Jesse Helms. Ingram had won the nomination in an extraordinary upset against a conservative banker who had been JFK's commerce secretary. Ingram campaigned for the nomination as Santa Claus, almost literally. He handed out gold-colored campaign tokens and promised, if you elect me your senator, this will be money in your pocket. The banker he ran against, his name was Luther Hodges, countered that his business expertise would help fight inflation by persuading the government to spend less. In choosing Ingram, in other words, the Democratic voters of North Carolina had issued the most stinging possible rebuke to the new fashionable politics of austerity. In the general election, campaigning against Helms, Ingram, naturally, uttered not a word against excessive government spending. Jimmy Carter then landed in North Carolina late in September and told the attendees at an Ingram campaign event that they had to vote Democrat to, quote, get the government's nose out of the people's business. He immediately returned to Washington and vetoed a $2.4 billion public works bill, observing, quote, there are no problems more serious in our country than inflation. The 300-word veto statement used the word inflation 6 times. By then, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill had been loaded up in the Senate with so many weakening amendments written by an aggressive young first-term Republican senator that it became nicknamed the Humphrey-Hawkins Hatch Bill. Know that guy, Orrin Hatch? Still, Carter wanted to veto it as inflationary. His chief policy advisor, Stuart Eisenstadt, persuaded him to sign it by insisting it was, quote, one of the few bills we have in which we are clearly aligned with our major constituencies, labor and the minority community. Ted Kennedy still intended to support Carter for re-election. Some of you may know that he eventually ran against Carter. But he wrote in his memoir, my commitments buckled a bit in the fall of 1978 when some friends of mine inside the administration leaked to me some portion of Carter's proposed budget requests. It was clear that in the name of harnessing inflation, the president intended to starve some important domestic programs that mattered a great deal to me. That was around the time the White House brought in a group of black legislators to discuss turning out black voters for the election. Representatives John Conyers and Ron Dellums got into a shouting match with Walter Mondale over the administration's prioritizing of inflation over the crisis of black unemployment, which was running at 20%. The following weekend, the Congressional Black Caucus held a banquet that was so big it had to be spread over the ballrooms of 2 separate hotels joined by closed-circuit TV. Carter covered his back by pointing to the button on his jacket, reading Justice Through Jobs, pass Humphrey Hawkins. He brought down the House with a rollicking call and response speech. Then, however, came a presentation by the esteemed political economist Stephen Morris. You probably know him better by his stage name, Stevie Wonder. He gave the post-banquet concert. He started noodling on his electric piano and talking about what the Humphrey-Hawkins bill started out as, what it looked like now, and Carter's claim that that it remained a strong jobs bill. He concluded his little speech, I call bullshit. He brought down the House. A few weeks later, the 95th Congress adjourned with about a 2-to-1 Democratic majority. This is how the Washington Post described its accomplishments. An overwhelmingly Democratic Congress had increased Social Security taxes. It had willingly voted large increases in defense spending, but shied away from expensive domestic initiatives and concentrated on cutting the federal budget deficit. It passed a tax reform that included $3.5 billion in corporate tax cuts, a $2.1 billion cut in capital gains taxes, socked it to lower income taxpayers by eliminating the deductibility of state and local taxes, and blended in a series of narrow interest amendments that would benefit specific countries and industries, including a provision of granting a tax break to the heirs of the Gallo wine estate. It gave oil companies a natural gas price deregulation bill they fought unsuccessfully for 25 years, and rejected virtually every proposal put forward by organized labor. All in all, the Post concluded, the American business class clearly displaced the agenda of social and economic issues that has dominated congressional politics since the inauguration of the New Deal 45 years ago. Carter then signed their tax bill, which let a millionaire who lived off investments to pay a lower tax rate than a salaried worker earning the median income, and gave the upper half of taxpayers 79% of its benefits. He returned to the road to campaign for Democratic candidates. One of his stops was Minnesota, where it enraged him to learn that some Democrats were reluctant to campaign for the winner of the primary for the late Hubert Humphrey's seat. He was a businessman named Donald Short. His main campaign promise was to work for an immediate 50% across-the-board income tax cut, in contrast to the Republicans' Kemp-Roth tax cut, which would only cut taxes 30% over 3 years. Carter then wrote in his diary, "This is one group of Democrats with whom I feel uncomfortable. They have a commitment to political suicide in order to prove some far-left philosophical point. It is really disgusting." He returned home and delivered on television what he called a frank talk with you tonight about our most serious domestic problem. That was inflation, which was now running at 8.9%. Here's how he promised he would fight it. He would, quote, redouble our efforts to put competition back into the free enterprise system by cutting away the regulatory thicket that has grown up around us and is giving our free enterprise system a chance to grow up in its first place. I must have got that wrong. He would slash federal hiring. He said, I don't have all the answers. Nobody does. But part of the answer, he said, was that Americans would have to make do with less. He said he would, quote, oppose any further reductions in federal income taxes. He implored all employers in the country to limit total wage increases to a maximum of 7% per year. He promised to redouble our efforts to put competition back into the regulatory thicket. He concluded by insisting, whether our efforts are successful will finally depend on you as much as me. Reducing the deficit will require difficult and unpleasant decisions. We must face a time of national austerity. Hard choices are necessary if we want to avoid consequences that are even worse. The 1978 off-year elections that followed 2 weeks later. He's vetoing public works. He's saying, I'm not going to give you a tax cut. He's saying, the Democrat Party can't give you anything. Vote for us. We're the best yet for movement conservatives. In his first newspaper column after the voting, Ronald Reagan gave a shrewd analysis as to why. Quote, for Democratic politicians long used to harvesting votes by dispensing nearly unlimited amounts of middle-class tax dollars, the new reality is going to be hard to get used to. No one has yet explained satisfactorily how a politician can be a fiscal conservative and liberal about paternalistic social programs at the same time. No wonder there were some sweaty Democratic brows the other night. A Democrat, a Watergate baby, by the way, Tom Foley of Washington, said much the same thing a few months later. Tight budgets strain all the natural fault lines of the Democratic Party. The pressure will intensify as we approach the presidential election year and each group starts pressing its claims. Note something about that formulation. It takes for granted that Democrats who endorsed traditional Keynesian spending were not serving the public interest in a broader national prosperity. They were following an outmoded political habit, frustrated by the fact that the pie that they were used to dividing was shrinking. Now, as you may know, this was the period when conservatives devised the fiscally dubious but politically brilliant strategy that liberated the Republican Party from the albatross of austerity politics, the scam known as supply-side economics. In brief, the claim was that slashing individual and corporate taxes across the board would spur such dynamism in the economy that, like a miracle of the loaves and fishes, revenues to the federal treasury would actually increase, so voters would never have to miss out on any of the goodies originally bestowed upon them by Democrats. In 1976, the Wall Street Journal writer Jude Wanniski labeled this his two Santa Clauses theory. The first Santa Claus was the Democrats, the one that nobody shot, a role that they had abandoned when they started acting like Scrooge. This opened the field, Wanniski argued, for the Republicans to become the new Santa Claus, the gift being tax cuts. Ronald Reagan became the theory's biggest booster. Would it work as economics? Another leading supply-side advocate, Irving Kristol, later admitted in a Wall Street Journal article that he had no idea. This debate can get very This debate can get very confusing at times, as any debate on economics is likely to be, he said. But it is politics that is the real issue here, not economics. He said that both the massive increase in defense spending that Reagan was calling for and the Kemp-Roth tax cut might indeed create massive budget deficits. But, he said, quote, the neoconservative is willing to leave these problems to be coped with by the liberal interregnums. He wants to shape the future and will leave it to his opponents to tidy up afterwards. Here's the story of how one Democratic candidate in 1978, Colorado Senator Floyd Haskell, who was a tax lawyer, responded to his opponent's advocacy of supply-side economics. Haskell, who advocated a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, compared his opponent, Representative William Armstrong, to Pappy Pass-the-Biscuits O'Daniel, the Texas populist who in a 1941 Senate special election against Lyndon Johnson promised voters $40 every Monday. He would order the hillbilly band he traveled with to launch into a tune every time someone asked how he would pay for it. He was kind of the basis of that great movie, The Face in the Crowd. A reporter pointed out that O'Daniel had beaten Lyndon Johnson. Is that so? Haskell responded. I didn't know that. Haskell lost in November by 20 points. Then, as is well known, in the summer of 1979, thanks to a series of unlikely accidents and events that were almost comical, Jimmy Carter ended up nominating as his Federal Reserve Chair one of the nation's most aggressive inflation hawks, Paul Volcker. That fall, the Federal Reserve Board, swallowing doubts and acting as William Grider narrates in his classic volume Secrets to the Temple, how the Federal Reserve runs the country, largely out of fear that, of threats from Germany that they would withdraw support from the dollar, instituted a Milton Friedman-style monetary shock. The American economy was soon veritably drenched in Democrat-directed fiscal prudence. Here was the result. Inflation accelerated. By April of 1980, it was 14.7%. And then, after 2 years of holding steady at 6%, unemployment by July of 1980 was 7.8%. In the crucial swing state of Michigan, it was well over 12%. Then, naturally, austerity having failed, the cry was heard across the land that the only thing that could possibly help was more austerity. In February, the Washington Post thundered that if President Carter wants to move fast in inflation, he only has one lever that will make much difference. He will have to start cutting his budget rapidly and severely, not only next year's budget, but the current one. The New York Times, that ever-judicious gray lady, observed that nobody any longer knows for sure how to slow inflation, but that radical budget cuts were necessary anyway, and that even if the economy unexpectedly roared back to health and produced a surplus, it should be retained. In March, Newsweek exulted, however it is achieved, a balanced budget would have almost magical significance. Citibank's chief economist said the budget has raised inflationary expectations more than anything, so cutting federal spending is exactly what we need to restore confidence and cut those high expectations. That's interesting, that language, cut high expectations. Democrats joined the chorus. Representative Richard Gephardt said, when you have bank executives come in and say, we're getting close to bank lines, people get frightened. If ever there was a time in recent history to balance the budget, this is it. What a moral hazard. If you're a banker, you just go to a politician and say, we're going to have bank lines. Senate Majority Leader Robert Byrd called the leaders of both houses together for 46 hours of negotiations to put forward a slate of radical budget cuts so we can all walk the plank together. The next week, Carter proposed billions in roughly equal spending cuts and revenue increases, in other words, tax increases, which joined Federal Reserve credit limits in a coordinated attack to intentionally spur a mild recession. To make a long story short, very ably told by Aaron Wildavsky and Joseph White in their 1989 book, The Deficit in the Public Interest, The Search for Responsible Budgeting in the 1980s, consumer borrowing not only stopped growing, but turned negative. The economy, which had already begun to falter, fell off the cliff. Just in time, one didn't need to add, for election season. The most famous line in Ronald Reagan's acceptance speech took on the Democrats, Luke, can you get that last clip ready, ethic of austerity head on. Can you put the, do you see any motion in there?
Yep.
Okay.
They tell us they've done the most that could humanly be done. They say that the United States has had its day in the sun, that our nation has passed its zenith. They expect you to tell your children that the American people no longer have the will to cope with their problems, that the future will be one of sacrifice and few opportunities. My fellow citizens, I utterly reject that view. The American people, the most generous on earth, who created the highest standard of living, are not going to accept the notion that we can only make a better world for others by moving backward ourselves. And those who believe we can have no business leading this nation.
Thanks. Cut off. By the way, in Jimmy Carter's acceptance speech, he got Hubert Humphrey's name wrong. His middle name was Hubert Horatio Humphrey, and Carter gaffed it. He said Hubert Hornblower Humphrey. the guilty conscience for selling him out. He says, he says, the American people, the most generous on earth, are not going to accept the notion that we can make a better world for others by moving backward ourselves. They could not accept that, plainly. Reagan won in a landslide. There are lots of reasons Jimmy Carter lost, of course. Posterity reminds us, however, that a big part of the story was the loss of the so-called Reagan Democrats in states like Michigan. The quarter before the presidential election, all of the car companies lost hundreds of millions of dollars. As we know, a lot of the reason for that was racial attitudes. Perhaps another contributing factor was that they were not stupid. Maybe they saw that the Democrats were shooting Santa Claus. What were the political consequences of that austerity? According to the CBS New York Times exit poll, the three most important issues for voters, named by 33, 24, and 21% respectively, were inflation in the economy, jobs and unemployment, and balancing the federal budget. Those who named balancing the budget as the most important in making their decision favored Reagan by 65 to 27%. They believe what Ronald Reagan also said at that convention, that Carter was the head of a government which has utterly refused to live within its means. None of a Democratic president's austerity obsession, nor his demonstrated success in reducing budget deficits, had rubbed off on voters at all. It never does. 4 years later, Ronald Reagan won an even bigger landslide, this time saying in his acceptance speech that he had cured an inflation that was, quote, a deliberate part of the Democrats' official economic policy, needed, they said, to maintain prosperity. He scourged Carter for burdening Americans with 20% interest rates, even though that was not his doing, but that of the independent Federal Reserve chairman, Paul Volcker, in a policy that Ronald Reagan, by reappointing Volcker, implicitly endorsed. He won against the Democrat, Walter Mondale, who he labeled Vice President Malaise, and whom, in his own acceptance speech that summer, promised a policy of austerity, too. 4 years later, the man who became governor of Massachusetts by promising to run the state like a bank became the Democrats' nominee, Michael Dukakis, and lost. 4 years after that, the nominee won by promising to be a new kind of Democrat and ending welfare as we know it, but only hung on for his reelection largely because of his promise to save Medicare from the depredations of a Republican Congress. This was Bill Clinton's version of the North Carolina insurance commissioner who gave away the gold tokens that he promised to be money in your pocket. Barack Obama chose to stock his economic cabinet full of investment bankers, princelings of austerity, every one. Nancy Pelosi, even now, has promised that if the American people elect a Democratic Congress next month, they will be rewarded by instituting a pay-go rule to ban deficit spending by Congress. It won't make a difference. Republicans will bequeath Democratic presidents massive deficits, just like Irving Kristol recommended, because, as Dick Cheney told George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. Republicans will continue to bray, as Ronald Reagan did in 1976, that for Democrats to warn against inflation is like getting a lecture on fire prevention from Mrs. O'Leary's cow. And pundits will continue to write what Joe Nocera did in the New York Times in 2013 when Republicans shut down the government. The fault was with, quote, those banana Republicans, but only because, quote, a party controlled by its most extreme faction will ultimately be forced back to the center. The Democrats learned that when Walter Mondale was losing to Ronald Reagan and Michael Dukakis lost to George Bush. And unless this baleful pattern of 40 years breaks, each new Democratic presidential nominee or president will try to roll that same mossy old austerity rock up the hill and will get bonked by a gang of pundits hurling it back. But the tragic figure won't be the columnist who's just doing his job as assigned by America's ideological fates, but that Democrat who tries, confident in his or her belief that this time, as politics and as policy, austerity will finally work. Thank you.
Well, that was hopeful and happy. So I'm just going to do a couple of setup questions just to get us going, and then just walk around and hand the mic out like I usually do. So the first one is this, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I want to bring it out here. So the simplest explanation for what that whole period is, I'll put my Marxist hat on and say it was a crisis of profits. So you have inflation. Once you have inflation running at, let's say, 7%, you need to have an 8% real rate of return on investment to make 1%. So if you're used to a world in which you've got 3 to 4% growth and 2 to 3% inflation, you used to basically contract for 5%. Over a very short period of time, that disappears, and you're basically burning money. So investment falls. That's why you also get a fall in employment, because productivity falls at the same time as you have inflation. So I can blame the whole thing on an investor strike, and then I want to say Jimmy Carter basically is the hand, the tool of capitalist interest. But none of what you have told me and none of what you have written actually tells me that that's true. That what's actually going on is a person who's seriously disconnected from democratic policy elites, their conversations, who it really comes at it with a very moralistic attitude, an actual real Baptist attitude, and really does believe that it's the same thing. A family can't spend more than its means. The government's the same. Why doesn't everybody understand this? So it's the morals rather than the Marxism that's driving the story. Is that right?
I think that's a really interesting perspective, and it does. I do feel like I kind of like in this book I'm working on, kind of have to go back to the drawing board about why. There was the statistic I stuck in there. Why in the exit polls 33% of Americans said that inflation was their most important reason for choosing who they did for president. I mean, sure, it sucks to have to pay more for something, 1 year to the next. Coffee, for example, was like 50. The inflation for coffee was like 50%, right? I mean, but 10% really. It's like a car costs $10,000 one year and $11,000 next year. I mean, that's not really the end of the world. There were some, really ugly things that happened. For example, home prices skyrocketed in California, as they are now. The property tax system was unfair for technical reasons, and people were paying, 50, 60, 70, 100% more, in property taxes 1 year to the next. But as Mark points out to me, that wasn't counted in inflation indexes. So why did people, as a matter of kind of populism, consider inflation such a terrible thing? After all, most Americans didn't own bonds. The most of their income wasn't investment income. And one of the things Mark pointed out to me was actually inflation is good for homeowners.
Because it eats away the value of the debt.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
if you're
Debt is cheaper.
That's why the baby boomers have big houses. Because in 1970, you sign a 30-year contract at 4%, and inflation goes to 12. By 1980, 40% of the value of your house has been eaten by the bank.
Right.
So there was a huge payoff, depending on the assets that you held, to actually sitting through an inflation. The notion that everyone lost is a really great political story, but it simply wasn't
doesn't
true.
work. So it's one of these. It's one of these, many incidences in which people quote unquote vote against their economic interests, right? In fact, relatively speaking, it makes them better off, relationally to rich people. So what's going on? I think it's really interesting to think about it in cultural terms. People did talk about, what happens when you kind of, can't make, plans. You can't, sort of expand your business, blah, 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 blah. But I think much as kind of the deficit becomes sort of a signifier for bad economics now, I think inflation becomes a signifier for bad economics, then. If only 10%, even an unemployment rate of 10% means 90% of people are, employed, And I think in the case of Jimmy Carter, it's kind of a puzzle to me. Yes, it's true. This is a guy who grew up on kind of a farmstead in which they, rendered their own soap, and tanned their own hides and did their own blacksmithing. And he said in his memoir that it was much like a farm 2,000 years ago. And he would talk about, consumption as something that was very unsatisfying to the soul. He would talk about the ennui of affluence. So yes, he had a kind of austerian temperament. But it doesn't explain to me why someone like Stuart Eisenstadt, who I quoted, who had been one of Hubert Humphrey's economists, was so scared of inflation as he reveals in his memoir that came out this year. He wanted to do more austerity. He thinks they should have done more austerity. That was the answer. It doesn't explain to me why all these liberal economists in the spring of 1976 become so convinced that a government jobs program would be inflationary. And I don't have good answers for that. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm here. I want to learn from Mark about why people who didn't necessarily have a stake, as the Marxists put it, in the state as kind of the ruling committee of the bourgeoisie. It's really easy, and I write in my book. About how the business class became radically activist and spent millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars on very aggressive and very deceptive public relations campaigns against regulation, against against liberal fiscal policy, for tax cuts, right? But it wouldn't have, like any propaganda campaign, it wouldn't take on unless it touched some kind of nerve. And I don't have a good answer about why it touched that kind of nerve. So I look forward to further conversations with Mark about that.
Just one more from me before I pass around the mic. So Carter puts this on the table, and the Democrats, in a sense, get locked into it. But it fails spectacularly. That's what you just told us. It completely fails. And then Reagan comes in and basically says, well, we'll do a defense build-up and tax cuts, and then I don't really care about anything because it'll just take care of itself. And you end up with a huge deficit.
That's
At
right.
the same time, you've got 20% interest rates, you have a massive recession, and you do get this massive disinflation. You then have the opening up of the financial sector. You've got a pent-up demand for credit. That's the Morning in America story, right? It's nothing to do with increasing revenues. It's basically financialization.
Also, deregulated banking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, exactly. That was 78 when that starts. So, but the point is, deficits are the name of the game. But they get to the mid-1980s, the Democratic strategy is the twin deficits, right? Beat up on deficits. And then Clinton comes in, and the first thing is he wants to do a stimulus. Then it's suddenly, no, I have to do deficits. So as you say, they've been doing this for 40 years. Why don't they learn? It's not a complex thing. It's really not. It's a losing hand. It's like if we were playing poker, right, and you just kept coming up with two pair, I just kill you. That's how this works.
Luckily, they are learning. We're facing a different Democratic Party than we were, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, certainly 5 years ago. Democratic socialists are getting elected to Congress. Nancy Pelosi is, on her way out. But why haven't they learned, right? I think a lot of it, it does suggest that it's ideological. They're talking to investment bankers who are the ones who are telling them how the world works, even as they themselves, as someone like Alan Greenspan or who's our guy,
Bernanke or
all those guys.
Yeah,
Well, no, the Democrats, the Citibank guy, Rubin. They're saying, oh wait, we were wrong. This isn't working after all. Greenspan made a remarkable mea culpa. He thought markets were efficient, and turns out they're not efficient. Oops, sorry, right? So those are the guys, they're talking to, and why are they talking to those guys? It's because those are the guys who, signed the checks. Goldman Sachs.
So it does come back down to the instrumentalist view of politics at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think there's some really good propaganda about balance my family's finances. Why can't the government do that?
Because you don't get to issue your own debt.
Well, and also then you get into, of course a Brit is going to, ask that question because they don't understand America's, or a deal, of slavery and race, in which basically the American people do see, liberal fiscal policy as a way to distribute income to people who are seen as, undesirable and not as American as they. So that's the real kind of puzzle of Americanism. And, the sort of ideology of entrepreneurialism and individualism and the idea that, every American who is not a millionaire thinks that they're going to be a millionaire, and all those strange things that make America, America, And, you can give a brief for individualism. Sweden didn't invent bluegrass or jazz, but it's, it's one of those crazy things that is both inexplicable but also deeply rooted.
Who wants to go first? Check this is working. Yes, it is. Or it keeps dropping out. These things keep dropping out all the time.
Hi, Rick. Robert Self.
Hey.
Out. Should I just not even speak into it? Yeah, no, that's okay. So no,
Carter's microphone. Carter's
every week.
Carter's, you might know that Carter's teleprompter went out during his 1980 speech too, and also that Ted Kennedy gave like the best anti-Carter campaign speech ever given at the Democratic convention.
so this is great stuff, and I'm super excited about the book. And I would never dispute that there's a difference between the Great Society and Air of Limits, if nothing else as a metaphor for government, to be sure. And I think you've outlined not just Carter's, but the late 70s Democratic Party's austerity pretty nicely. And the way in which we've had 40 years since. But I wonder if it's worth, in your thinking, going actually back 40 years earlier to see how constrained democratic Keynesianism always was. And I don't mean to say that there's not a break in the 70s, but arguably the biggest Keynesian moments in the post-war period come under first a Republican President Eisenhower and the Highway Bill, which is a Democratic Congress but a Republican president, and then military Keynesianism. Right. There's never really a true Keynesian consensus, despite what Nixon says, right. In the 70s. And I just wonder if that's not worth putting on the table to contextualize Carter a little bit, because it's not as if the Democrats are just throwing money around for decades before the 70s.
Right. Yeah, I would love to know and learn more about that. I mean, one thing that really struck me in reading Judith Stein's Pivotal Decade, which talks about democratic political economy and really is very forcefully critical of the Democrats always kind of being in the pocket of finance capital just about forever, is she points out that basically Democrats in the Kennedy administration basically gave away America's manufacturing advantage, basically wrote trade deals and rules and I guess passed laws and treaties that allowed American factories to, open up in tax advantage ways in Europe, and basically a technology transfer to Japan. All these things for various, kind of Cold War geostrategic reasons, but with, really no sense of political consequences. So that's a slightly, different way in which the Democrats, were not always, kind of what we think they are, right?
Kennedy and Johnson both were on tax cuts.
Right, and Kennedy and Johnson, although they were to be fair, they were progressive tax cuts.
Yeah.
They weren't across the board 30% for everybody. And I'd love to know more about sort of what like an Adlai Stevenson sort of thought about the idea of spending. But Lyndon Johnson, when he took over in 1964, said to his budget advisors, unless you get this budget under $100 billion, you're not going to pee a drop. He said, when he was designing the war on poverty, no doles, and even sort of like the federal housing bill was written by Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, the big conservative. And yet, yes, this idea that Democrats are always the people spending like drunken sailors. Now, on the other hand, I mentioned Jimmy Carter's, going after the 80 water projects, right? There's a great book about water politics in America called Cadillac Desert, a classic book. And he was so Jimmy Carter, right? He was Mr. Detail-oriented. When he wanted to reform the tax code, he literally read all 10,000 pages of the tax code. In between his election and his inauguration, he also read the entire Army Corps of Engineers planning documents, and a lot of the projects were absolutely crazy. I mean, it was just like a $1 zillion dam that would serve one farm in Nevada, So a lot of this stuff was very kind of boondoggly, but that's not really Keynesianism either. The Democratic Party. The more you look at it, the more complicated it is. I just got back from my last trip before this was to Vanderbilt, where I lectured about the part of my book which is about the Christian right. And I went to this wonderful place, the Vanderbilt News Archive, where you can watch all the network news broadcasts. That's why I bootlegged. Don't tell anyone that you saw that Jerry Brown thing, because the networks are very proprietary about this kind of stuff. But I bootlegged, like all these videos and took notes on videos. And one of the things I learned was there was an expose of Russell Long, Senator Russell Long, who was the head of the Senate Finance Committee, the guys who wrote the tax bills. And I hadn't realized, I knew he was Huey Long's son, but I hadn't realized that he owned hundreds of millions of dollars worth of oil leases, offshore and onshore, and that they basically kind of been stolen from the state by his dad. And he was writing tax bills, and he was in charge of the energy bill, right? So, here's this Democratic Party, in which one of the most powerful members of it, is Trumpian in his levels of, of just intrinsic corruption, right? But then you also have, I was getting all pedantic with one of the staffers about Claiborne Pell, the great Democratic Rhode Island senator who said, we'll just give money to anyone who wants to go to college. Which clearly, we can talk about sort of higher education Keynesianism, which, was a big part of what happened in California and what turned California into this middle-class utopia under Jerry Brown's dad, Pat Brown, and which Reagan ended by instituting tuition for the first time in California. So, yeah, also a wonderful thing to look at, too.
Yeah? Was you? No?
Sort of two partially related questions going back to the moralism issue. I'm wondering, the Jerry Brown thing, there's a kind of anti-consumerism.
Very much so.
Hippie.
This is the guy, for those who don't know, Jerry Brown slept on a mattress in an apartment. He drove a Plymouth.
Right. So I'm wondering, is there a link in this first round of austerity between sort of anti-consumerism and hippieism that gets its Baptist version that's worth thinking about?
Absolutely. I think a big part of
The second part of it is related to that, which is you might think that if you were anti-consumerist, you'd be attracted to the one tax the federal government doesn't have in America, which is the value-added tax. And I'm wondering whether there was any discussion about the value-added tax as a possibility of fixing the fiscal wagon, because that might have had another set of consequences.
That's an interesting question. I haven't seen it, but I'm sure there's probably a book to be written about all the planning that went into Jimmy Carter's original tax package, which basically was completely transformed into a Republican supply side tax package because of this freight train about tax cuts. I would look at Stuart Eisenstadt's memoir, which is about 800 pages long, which would have something about that. I can't think of any talk about that. I think that Jimmy Carter never had a problem with kind of like doing these kind of kludgy sort of Rube Goldberg things where, if I would say, well, he would understand that, sales taxes are regressive, but he would have had no problem instituting a regressive tax and then having credits on the back end. That's what they did for energy. So I don't have a good answer for that. But as far as the hippie part, I think it's really interesting that basically this stuff was associated with liberalism. It was associated with a liberalism that was I call it hair shirt patriotism in Invisible Bridge. That people just love the idea of sacrifice and doing more with less, and that was definitely an ethic in California. Jerry Brown was very popular, and William Proxmire, not exactly a hippie, but he was famous for kind of like having these shabby suits and jogging down the streets of Washington. And the Watergate babies. There's a book that kind of David Broder came out with in the middle of the 70s, kind of profiling a bunch of the new voices in Washington. And it's very clear that this generation of Democrats was a Kennedy generation, and quite idealistic. And they weren't sellouts, William Steiger wasn't a sellout. He was the Republican who, basically wrote the bill to lower the capital gains tax. These people saw themselves as doing the greatest good for the greatest number. They were very convinced by basically corporate lobbyists who told them that this was a route to prosperity. But at the same time, culturally, I think the kind of glittering plastic, tacky kind of Levittown, society was very unpopular. And a lot of that came through the Nader strain in the Democratic Party, which was incredibly successful. One of the things I enjoyed writing about the most in this manuscript was kind of hopefully reviving the reputation of why Nader was great, and all the lives he saved. Things like ERISA, protecting pensions, or there was the guy who Orrin Hatch beat. Was this guy named Frank Moss, who no one remembers. He was the guy who banned, cigarette smoking advertising. He was the guy who made warranties federally protected. He got the Federal Trade Commission. There's this guy named Michael Perchuk, who was kind of a household name for a brief period because he was Carter's FTC chair. He was a Nader guy. He did amazing stuff, and the Business Coalition, crushed him. But this idea that you were protecting the public from rapacious capitalists was part of this liberalism, but Keynesianism was not. And part of the problem was cultural, because Keynesianism, the idea of basically shoving money into the hands of middle-class people, that was George Meany. That was Hubert Humphrey. That was the guys who had taken over the Democratic Party. That was Mayor Daley. Mayor Daley was the great builder. He just was the state bird in Illinois was the construction crane, right? So that was kind of seen as, it's kind of almost has the cultural savor of building giant airports in Vietnam. And why should we make that was at its worst, sure. And the idea that the white working class was racist and pro-war and all the rest. So there's definitely a lot of that going on, and the bad guys were very shrewd and canny in taking advantage of that.
I'm going to walk us over here, but with a thought, which is we haven't mentioned organized labor.
Well, I just mentioned that they were basically seen as the dinosaurs.
Right, but also the incredibly corrupt dinosaurs. I mean, as someone who came over here in the late, well, I didn't come over here in the late 70s, came of age in the late 70s politically, and then come over here in the 90s, the way that Americans talk about unions, in completely contrast to what you experience, even in Britain, which is hardly Germany or Sweden. So there was this notion that labor was inherently corrupt, and that was the other side of the government trough.
Right.
So if that was what Keynesianism was, then it was game over, and that was never what Keynesianism was.
That's right. And there's this fascinating character who is endlessly fascinating in the Carter White House, Pat Caddell, who actually wasn't a staffer in the White House. He started his own company with clients like Saudi Arabia and Exxon, and kind of advised for the politics for the president on the side. Wrote half the Malaise speech, and basically there's this fascinating moment in which basically business and labor get together and agree on a labor law reform bill that will punish companies who violate labor law more strictly. And then basically business changes his mind and has the biggest PAC money-driven lobbying campaign in history to that point. While this is going on, Pat Caddell does a poll in which he's all over the media talking about that 70% of Americans think labor unions are all corrupt. And Jimmy Carter did not lobby for this bill. He didn't care about this bill. So labor was really it was very uncool. It was Hubert Humphrey. When Gary Hart. Okay, so I can answer your question about the hippies. Gary Hart had been George McGovern's campaign manager. By 1974, when he's running for the Senate, he is literally running against the New Deal. Also as an environmentalist, also as a limits guy, and he's the guy who says we're not a bunch of little Hubert Humphreys, right? Hubert Humphrey is like the cigar chomping, fat labor boss guy.
Hi, thanks for a fascinating talk, and with every comment, it's harder for me to sort of formulate a question because everybody's talking about elements of, I guess my basic question is, it takes a lot of people to make this kind of shift. I mean, Jimmy Carter didn't do it alone. I think you were reading from a New York Times article about what a Democratic Congress in 1978 had passed, a bill,
Washington Post op-ed,
a Washington Post. So there were a lot of Democrats on board with what Carter was doing, and you've described cultural shifts, and you've described some
Or they
political.
hated Carter and were also for austerity for other reasons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it just seemed like, why? I know that maybe this is the basic question that we keep asking, but like, why this big shift? Okay, you can understand why Reagan and people on the right wanted the shift. I get that, but and Jimmy Carter had this background and he had these values. Okay, that's fine. And some other Democrats went along with that for their own reasons and everything. But you were talking about labor unions, and you brought up the labor union issue. Maybe Hubert Humphrey is uncool, and maybe a lot of Americans think unions are bad and they vote against their own economic interests and all that. But if you're like a white working class person in the Rust Belt, unions have some, or they, in that era especially, they had some value for you, like, going to negotiate a better contract for you, even if you don't like black people, like, don't you want yours?
Yeah.
If you're against the idea of a big government giving money to, quote, undeserving people, however you define that, still, why are you going to all of a sudden go over to Reagan? I mean, in 1980. That's
read
the
the
best
book.
I can.
Read
That's
the
the
book.
best. No, I can't wait.
Well, for there's a great movie. Paul Schrader wrote it. The guy who wrote Taxi Driver, right? It's called what's it called? Blue Collar, right? And it's one of the first movies that Richard Pryor was in. And it's about three guys who rob their union because they're just being robbed by their union anyway. And it just gets to the idea that the unions are just one more asshole boss, who's telling you what to do. And Reagan is really important in this because, first of all, Reagan, was very canny rhetorically. He would say, "I was a union president. I'm a union member now," right? And he also had been the ideological trainee of the guy at General Electric in the 50s, where he worked as a spokesman, whose job it was to sell the workers of GE and the idea that the union was ripping them off, right? So this is a guy who pioneered focus groups. There was lots of rhetoric, that was, basically state of the art, propaganda, right? So that's one reason. There's, the racial thing. You can look at the famous Stanley Greenberg polls from 1984 in Macomb County, in which he just finds basically the most feral racism in the suburbs of Detroit, and these are guys who are very close to the bone economically. It's the Archie Bunker stuff. You should read Jefferson Cowie's book Staying Alive: The Last Days of the American Working Class. He talks about a guy who, there was a guy named there was a auto worker who the New York Times would visit every 4 years, 72, 76, and 80, who eventually voted for Ronald Reagan. There's just lots of wonderful work about this, but just the idea that unions weren't any help. They weren't keeping the factories open, right? They weren't closing the factories, although the propaganda was that they were closing the factories. It was these ridiculous wage demands that they were making. So it's, in a lot of ways that's the big mystery. And we're all kind of groping towards an explanation.
Can I give you this one?
But is it also the fact that union density is going down? And then also at any point in our history, most of the U.S. working people were not unionized anyways, right? So you have that in addition to the fact that
So it's easy to divide the working class. These union guys are not your friends. They're the people who are basically instead of saying I want that too, they're saying I don't want them to, I don't want them to have it if I don't have it.
Right.
And I mean, this is there's a book on Mark's shelf, classic, amazing book. It came out in 1983 called "The New Politics of Inequality" by the Washington Post, then Baltimore Sun's Thomas Edsall, and was the first guy to actually go into the NLRB statistics and saying, wow, corporations every year in the 70s are challenging like 50% more union elections. And yes, they see their profits going down and they are fighting for their profits. And stuff that's going on culturally, it's interesting. People do talk about this culturally, that corporations used to be happy with whatever a 5% profit rate. Well, you're pointing out that their profits are being, eaten up by inflation. So of course they want double-digit profits, which means, tighter labor margins and all the rest. But yes, the labor law reform fight in 1978 was really fascinating because it was basically like, to quote another movie, I would talk about a lot of movies in my books, Norma Ray was about a real factory, J.P. Stevens, that was basically just firing union organizers left and right, and they were the first people to say, well, we'll get fined $50,000 by the NLRB. Great, that cost us less than a union would, and this labor law bill was written to kind of punish people in ways that had teeth for doing things that were already against the law. And you would why would a corporation that has good relations with their union want this? Well, again, everything is becoming more zero sum. I say in the book that basically business was becoming a class for itself instead of a class in itself. It was becoming class conscious, in a way that it hadn't been before. There's all this literature like the Edsells and all the corporate lobbying. Oh, this actually gets to the why was there this backlash that made austerity attractive? One of the things was during the 60s, the expectations and the kind of assumptions of abundance were so over the top, right? And this is like, in a way, it's kind of well, in a way, it's kind of like this cross ideological thing. I mean, whether you are a hippie who believes that you can have like a commune where everyone is just having drugs and having sex all the time and not working, or you're saying let's go to the moon by 1969, or you're Lyndon Johnson lighting the White House Christmas tree in 1964 and saying this is the most hopeful time since Christ was born in Bethlehem, or saying we're going to cure heart disease. It's just like this idea that America is this great cornucopia that's going to last forever. That's setting people up for trauma. Once the people, they realize they've kind of sold a bill of goods. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. Kind of under the guts of the story is, people just being like, wow, America, I've been told America is one thing, and it turns out it's not. So for a guy whose factory is shutting down, let's make it great again. That was Reagan's original slogan in 1980 until they fired his ad man. Yeah.
That's actually a very good segue for the question that I want to ask, which I hope won't be too unwelcome because it does require talking about the present. And I hope, and I hope also if you address this in your opening comments, I apologize for missing them. But I am wondering about how this history reads differently in light of the last 2 years, and about whether or not some of the, let's call them revelations for some significant portion of the American pundit class, that economic anxiety is actually about something else. Or about the corruption and venality of certain segments of the American political class, et cetera. If rereading the late 1970s and early 1980s in the age of Trump, what kind of new things come to light that you think you're seeing by doing this history at this moment?
I wrote a magazine article about that in the New York Times Magazine about how Trump changes the way people are thinking about and writing about the history of conservatism. One way I think it's changing for me in this project is stuff I would have been like, oh, those guys are extremist kooks. They're not really important part of the story. I'm much more willing to include them because they're obviously part of the genealogy. And one of the things I've specifically realized, and I haven't quite pulled it all together yet, I will kind of in a part that I haven't yet written, is the Ku Klux Klan is everywhere. There's a Klansman that wins, a Democratic nomination for a congressional seat in Michigan, gets like 35% of the vote, which was more than there's a Republican. I mean, one wins as a Republican in Detroit suburbs and gets like 10% more of the vote than a Republican got last time. There's a Democrat who wins the Klansman in a primary in a California suburb. There's the Greensboro massacre in 1979, in which Klansmen get into a fight with communists and shoot 5 communists. There's just these little things. There's the guy who shot Larry Flint. It turns out that he also was shooting black men in interracial couples. There's all these. This is kind of just kind of float to the top that I wouldn't really have thought about or noticed before. How the Klan most famously kind of became an issue in that Ronald Reagan got the endorsement of the Klan, who said their platform is just like ours, and then he is kind of getting whacked about this, and he goes to he claims that Jimmy Carter started his campaign in the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan, which turns out to not be true. So suddenly there's this little kerfuffle going on for a week about the Ku Klux Klan and the campaign. So I would have probably just not really considered that particularly important, but it looks more important now.
I had a question about a comment that Reagan makes during his acceptance speech at the RNC in 1980. He says at some point in the clip that you played that, contrary to what Carter would have us believe, we don't have to tighten our belts so that people in other countries can get ahead, or something to that effect.
I think you
The rest of the world?
misheard. I'm not sure he said that. I don't think, and that's interesting too. So, in a lot of ways, another thing is, another thing I write about that's a little different is, I mean, I really emphasize how nasty and evil and hateful the Christian right was, and kind of almost genocidal in their thinking about gays. But one thing about Reagan that I emphasize is that he was extremely generous in his rhetoric and talk about immigrants. He loved immigrants. He loved the idea that people would want to come to the United States. And this is a very kind of Austrian kind of James Buchanan kind of thing, but he also wants a North American union between Mexico and Canada and America. He literally says open borders, right? So part of this is just free flow of bodies and goods for completely libertarian reason, but he wraps it up in very high-minded rhetoric. So I don't think he would have said, he talked about the rest of the world.
I found it.
Okay, good, thanks.
My fellow citizens, I utterly reject that view. The American people, the most generous on earth, who created the highest standard of living, are not going to accept the notion that we can only make a better world for others by moving backwards ourselves.
Okay, yes, that would have been a reference to something like the Panama Canal Treaty, right? Which he saw as giving away, his rhetoric more aggressive in 1976, but that was in 1978, and he was, against it too. The idea that we were basically, it was the equivalent of giving away Alaska, and he did say that Jimmy Carter was going around the world apologizing for America, right? So that was definitely a reference to a certain kind of breastfeeding, kind of jingoistic nationalism, definitely. That basically part of the thing that Jimmy Carter was doing was not only was he saying we have to make do with less, but we have to be nicer to the rest of the world, And it didn't. One of the things that's interesting about, we haven't talked about this huge issue in the 1980 campaign, which was Iran and the hostages. And one of the things was there's this really, really incorrect, taken for granted notion that Carter was really hurt by the hostages. He was really hurt by the rescue failing. But if you actually look at the exit polls, people who consider Iran the most important issue were actually more for Carter than for Reagan. And the reason was because Reagan really, it was basically kind of assumed, since he said Vietnam was a noble cause, that he would just bomb Iran. And people were scared shitless about that. People were really scared about Reagan. And that's one of the reasons why this one debate they had, 5 days before the election, in which all of Carter's aides thought, oh my God, this doddering old man is going to sound like Barry Goldwater and terrify everyone, was so important, because Reagan sounded sensible and calm, even as he, basically, dissembled in very obvious ways. And the Carter people thought about it like a, kind of like a, high school debate contest where people had points and were right and wrong. So when Reagan said, when Jimmy Carter said, no, he really did, say that he wanted that Medicare would turn America into a socialist hellhole, and Reagan said, there you go again, because he claimed, oh, he just wanted a better Medicare bill. The Carter people were like, we won. He's lying. The media is going to fact check him. But it was so frustrating reading that the major media discourse about Carter was that he had suddenly turned mean. And what they meant by mean was he was saying, Reagan is lying. Why aren't you talking about this? Fascinating. Yeah.
It seems like just a comment and a question. So the comment is it seems like you would have a great book about the KKK as economic actors trying to fight for the wages of whiteness.
Well,
Oh, that was just a comment, but I have a question. If you want to answer that, that's great. But I do have a question, which
that's
is
all right.
Which is
we should. So the Klan tripled in the 70s. We should write a book about the 70s Klan.
They're really because we think about the earlier period. But anyway, the question is really presentist or futurist, which is what advice would you give Elizabeth Warren based on everything that you've researched?
Just keep on doing what you're doing. Yeah. I mean, she's so smart and so shrewd.
I mean, giving everything, right? I mean,
Yeah,
all
everything,
the challenges,
everything,
the
right.
cultural challenges,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
So
what
one of the
sort
things that's
talking
interesting,
points did you use?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Elizabeth Warren is she reminds me of, we think about the 60s, and we think of Tom Hayden, and we think of Martin Luther King, and we think of Malcolm X, and we think of all this dramatic stuff. But, the Claiborne Pells and the Frank Mosses, and, she really reminds me of a 1960s senator in that she says, here's a pressing policy problem. Here's a major omnibus landmark bill that would fix it, right? No one talks about it because, we're too busy talking about what we're talking about. But she just dropped this massive bill meant to solve America's housing crisis. Both segregated housing, undersupply of housing with all these kind of tax credits and incentives to open up housing in places like California. So yes. That's great. I think that the way Beto O'Rourke is so good at kind of doing this kind of simultaneously maintaining, and Michelle Goldberg just had a really good column about this, maintaining this very high-toned kind of uniting kind of Obama-like rhetoric, but also has these very he says he is a very much where there is no red America, no blue America. That's not his line, but that's kind of the kind of speech he gives while offering these very progressive policy solutions and doing gutsy things like saying Black Lives Matter, their right to take a knee, and I'm not going to criticize that. So I think that Obama has shown, and Beto O'Rourke has shown with his very strong performance so far, that kind of a very high-minded kind of optimistic rhetoric works pretty well from the Democrats. And can squeak out enough people in tough times, if you back it with what seems like a credible economic agenda, which Obama seemed to do on the campaign trail in 2008 before he, turned over his cabinet to, all the investment bankers.
But let me rain on that parade, just because I
Glad to
can.
hear it.
So in the last generals, Senator Clinton lost all men of all classes and all races by 12 percentage points.
Right.
That's never happened before.
Right.
And Elizabeth Warren is a pointy-headed Harvard professor.
But she.
How do you sell that?
So is Ted Cruz. He's a pointy-headed whatever law school he went to. I think that she talks about her Great Plains upbringing, and she talks the way she does, in which she is very good at communicating to and about very kind of ordinary people. And things change. It's like white racists voted for Obama in 2008. They didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Hillary Clinton does culturally present as a kind of an aloof, arrogant, East Coast, pointy-headed intellectual in a way that I don't think Elizabeth Warren does quite as much.
Do you think she'll say the words balanced budget?
I don't see it. Are there signs that she kind of buys that nonsense? Yeah. Maybe, it's like every Democrat, kind of has their own sort of skill, right? And she's an economics. She's a professor of political economy. One that is very good at communicating. As Charles Walker was. Kind of big economic issues in kind of ideologically potent ways. So maybe she'll be the one to break the spell.
Probably a good place to end it. Elizabeth saves us from 40 years of democratic creptitude on budgets.
Yes.
Thank you
nice.
very much, Rick Perlstein.
Thank you.